Friends, have you ever thought about your money and your future, and quite frankly, how to avoid becoming poor? You know, even when people get in their older years, they get concerned about, will I run out of money? Is my retirement sufficient? You see, money is how we keep score in a modern economy. Even in the scriptures, Ecclesiastes 10:19 says, money answereth all things, but we also know the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. But money, and we measure money in the United States in terms of dollars. Now, I saw a recent front cover of The Economist magazine, and it raised the question of a disappearing dollar, showing a worm eating away at the very substance of our dollar. Now, the question arises, will the dollar remain the world's reserve currency? You see, the dollar has been the world's reserve currency since 1944. And however, many central banks around the world, many other countries are opting for other currencies instead of the dollar. So what causes a currency to rise and fall? Well, it happens to be how much currency is circulation. How much currency has been printed? How much are we circulating around the world? Let's look at the debt bubble of the U.S. economy. And the debt bubble of the U.S. economy is something that is a picture of our economy that not many people have ever seen. Right now, we have roughly $25 trillion in total domestic debt. That's the federal government debt, state, county, municipal debt, corporate debt, mortgage debt, and consumer debt, all put in one big pile. You know, friends, debt has to be serviced. So how do we service debt? It is serviced with money. Now, when we look at the M2 money supply, we see that the M2 money supply is only about $7 trillion. Now, what is M2? Well, let's go back to the basic money supply. M1 is cash and currency in circulation plus demand deposits. M2, you add everybody's savings account money to M1. So M2, the broad base of money supply, is everybody's walking around money, checkbook money, plus their savings account money put in one big pile. So let's do the math. Subtract 7 trillion of money from 25 trillion of debt, and we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. As they say at NASA, we have a problem. So what is the problem? 18 trillion of the debt. These debtors have been asked to pay back debt with money that does not exist. So that goes back to what the Bible says, the borrower is servant to the lender. So one of two things will happen. Either, since there's not enough money to pay back the debt, there will be a default or a collapse of the economy, or we will have to print more money in order to pay back the debt. That's print more money or increase more credit to pay back the debt. So who determines whether we collapse the economy right now or whether we print more money and circulate more money and credit into the economy to keep the game going and keep the bubble floating for a while longer? Who determines that? Well, a few years ago, I was approached by producers for the Discovery Channel. They were producing a documentary on the Federal Reserve, which, by the way, folks, is neither federal and has doubtful reserves. It's a private bank that is owned by member banks. We looked at their script, ripped up the script, and rewrote it. And a production company produced a video called Monopoly Men. Monopoly Men is the product of our script and a well thought out production that shows you exactly how these unelected, non-governmental people, but private bankers, have more power than the President of the United States. You see, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve is more powerful than any President of the United States. He determines what the average person's car payment is going to be, what their house payment is going to be, and whether you have a job or not. And that, my friends, is total power. The host of the documentary, Dean Stockwell, asked the question, is there a secret history of the United States that a lot of us have never heard about?
Is there a secret history of the United States intentionally hidden by the mainstream media? Could there be a secret society of fat-moneyed businessmen whose agenda has been the cause of every major war and economic depression? Is there a shadowy elite gently pulling the strings of our world to bring about their own self-serving political program? The answers may surprise you.
Nearly 200 years ago, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "If the American people ever allow the banks to control the issuance of their currency, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property, until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers occupied."
Throughout the history of the United States, there's been this running battle over who controls how much money is in the system. Will it be some privately owned central bank, or will it be the people, the Congress, for the benefit of everybody in the country?
Everything evolves around the Federal Reserve, a private bank that was given a monopoly on the creation of paper money.
Every $100 bill which the Federal Reserve System prints and is sold to the United States at full face value represents a $100 loan. Even though the government pays for it, they still pay interest.
100 years after Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln pondered these same issues. The government should create, issue, and circulate all the currency, he said. Creating and issuing money is the supreme prerogative of government. Adopting these principles will save the taxpayers immense sums of interest, and money will cease to be the master and become the servant of humanity. What do the fears expressed by Jefferson and Lincoln and modern-day economists have to do with what President George Bush called the New World Order?
It's a conspiracy. What else can you call it? It's a conspiracy against the people of the United States and of the Western world.
Just when you think you're ahead of the game, someone changes the rhythm.
Some people have even alleged that a crime took place. Others believe it is simply a criminal conspiracy, albeit a conspiracy, to lead us into a new world order, which some call nothing but a code word for one world socialism. That's where we level everybody out, make everybody equal, equally poor, with the exception of the elite ruling class.
This week, we'll visit the scene of a crime so huge that most of you will not believe it to be real, and so perfect that even today, 86 years after the fact, few realize that the crime even took place. The creation of the Federal Reserve System was about more than just money. Some refer to it as the secret birth of a criminal conspiracy to rob the American middle class of its hard-earned wealth. Others believe it to be part of an attempt to bring the world under the control of a shadowy international elite that calls itself the New World Order. And through it all, we have wars, assassinations, and Martians. In fact, if it weren't for the Martians, you might have heard about this mother of all conspiracies a long time ago.
We know now, within the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
On October 30th, 1938, the Mercury Radio Network interrupts the music of Ramon Raquello and his orchestra from the Park Plaza Hotel of New York City for a special news bulletin. The infamous War of the Worlds broadcast begins with its terrifyingly real description of an invasion from Mars. And before the night is out, 1 million people will run panicked into the streets.
I'm extremely surprised to learn that a story which has become familiar to children through the medium of comic strips.
After what has been a closely guarded secret for nearly 50 years, Orson Welles' original broadcast turns out to be no mere show business stunt.
Should have had such an immediate and profound effect upon radio listeners.
But instead was a complex psychological warfare test conducted by C.D. Jackson for the Rockefeller Foundation. When the results are compiled nearly 2 years later, they are released to an elite whose names most men will not speak of over a whisper. Among them groups like the Bilderbergers, Trilateral Commission, CFR, and the Federal Reserve.
C.D. Jackson was the equivalent of being the head of the National Security Council in the White House under Eisenhower. He was the chief of psychological warfare.
The breakthrough discovery that the War of the Worlds broadcast was actually a psychological warfare test is key to understanding why experts believe that the Federal Reserve, the Bilderbergers, and other closed exclusive elite groups are pulling the strings that control our societies.
Well, it's a fraternity. They have a common objective, and this common objective is to maintain control.
America grew so rapidly and became wealthy so quickly that really we've always been the thorn in the side of this New World Order crowd. They've just never been able to get us completely under their control. So America is the target, and once they finally get us subdued, the rest of the world would fall very quickly.
Moguls like the late J.P. Morgan, a man so excessively wealthy his likeness adorns the tycoon card in the board game Monopoly, are all safely cloaked behind their own carefully constructed versions of history. But are the private agenda of these select few woven permanently into the fabric of world economy? Are we simply the unwitting pawns in a game whose rules were written amidst the clandestine corridors of private social clubs 100 years ago or more? Hundreds of miles south of the banking capital of the world, New York City, just off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island provided a winter retreat to the rich and famous. This tiny ocean getaway was formerly owned by the monopoly man himself, international financier J.P. Morgan. Here, in a conclave intended to remain secret forever, 6 international bankers plan what is to become America's most powerful private institution, the Federal Reserve System.
Story is one of the great untold stories of the 20th century. These bankers who got together, left Hoboken in a sealed train, and the reporters were going crazy. They knew this was big. These were 5 of the biggest bankers in the world getting on this sealed train. The reporters wanted to know what the hell was going on. And they didn't know for years what had happened.
You know, many ask the question, why? Why in the world would human beings allow this to happen? And then they allude to the possibility that it's the monopoly men that have a desire to control the economic and social behavior of all of us.
Andrew Gray, grandnephew of one of the 6 men who met to plot the creation of the Federal Reserve System, scoffs at talk of secret cabals.
Well, I'm asked whether the Jekyll Island meeting can be automatically classed as a conspiracy. And the answer, first of all, is that the need for secrecy does not necessarily imply conspiracy. Very important legislation of any kind cannot be drafted in public forum.
Back in 1910, they called themselves the Jekyll Island Club. Collectively, members represented more than 1/6 the wealth of the entire world. So anxious were they to keep any knowledge of their meetings secure, they used code names even when talking to friends. "We're going to Jamaica," they would say, and those in the know would understand they were traveling to Jekyll Island.
The immediate excuse was the money panic of 1907, which was engineered by Jacob Schiff and the Rockefellers to gain control of some corporations they were after. And so then they said, look, we've got another nationwide panic, we've got to have banking reform.
The birth of the Federal Reserve System, we know, was at Jekyll Island, Georgia, in a secret meeting that took place that was attended by Senator Aldrich, who was the chairman of the banking committee, and whose son I knew, incidentally, Winthrop Aldrich, when he was chairman of the Chase Bank.
The Aldrich Bill, as it was initially called, received such violent opposition from Democrats and reformers like William Jennings Bryan that despite avid lobbying by the monopoly men, the bill quickly went down to defeat.
Once the Aldrich Bill flopped, the bankers immediately moved to Plan B. It didn't work from trying to push it through with Republicans, so they tried to push it through with Democrats.
We had, in 1912, a very popular president, a Republican named William Howard Taft. The bankers needed Woodrow Wilson to sign this act into law. He did not have much charisma. He had not a chance against William Howard Taft.
Teddy Roosevelt. He was an explosion upon the political scene. Dynamic, outspoken, warm, colorful, exciting, inspiring. And under the surface was a man of ideals.
You could say that J.P. Morgan really owned Theodore Roosevelt. You see, his right-hand man, vice president of his bank in New York, George Perkins, lived at the White House. He was a liaison man with the president. And so they drug Theodore Roosevelt out of obscure retirement. Roosevelt formed the Bull Moose Party and split the Republican Party and elected Woodrow Wilson. That's the only way they could do it.
Woodrow Wilson, immediately after his inauguration, called a special session of the Congress to do away with the protective tariff, which had been the thing that had built this country. The second thing that happened was that the income tax came in. And the final thing was the creation of the Federal Reserve, which took place in December, around the Christmas holidays in 1913, that put the cap on this whole revolution.
Most of the senators had gone home for the Christmas holidays. We call that in legislative circles having the skids greased. And the skids were greased and they just slid it right on through. Without much fanfare, the president signed it. It became law of the land.
One of the major opponents during the Federal Reserve Act battle was Representative Charles Lindbergh from Minnesota, who, interestingly enough, was the father of aviator Lucky Lindbergh, the first guy to cross the Atlantic Ocean solo. And Lindbergh fought them tooth and nail and referred to the Federal Reserve Act as the worst legislative crime ever perpetrated in the history of the United States. And that may indeed well be true.
By 1916, even President Wilson was worried. He lamented, "The growth of the nation and all our activities are in the hands of a few men." Near the end of his life, Wilson said that he had been deceived into signing the Fed into law, reportedly murmuring just before he died, "I have unwittingly ruined my government."
In law, when any people meet together to plot to rob somebody, that becomes a criminal operation. It can never be anything else. Throughout its subsequent history, it can never overcome that initial criminal beginning. And that's where we are today, a criminal syndicate. That's all it is. It's all it ever has been.
Did the creation of the Federal Reserve represent a takeover of the United States by shadowy international financiers? Certainly, the Fed was designed to serve somebody's interest, but whose?
Not the American banking community. It was the international banking community. The Morgans were an international family. The fortune had first been made in England, but they were allied with the Rothschilds and others in England, and one of their agents drafted the script for the Federal Reserve.
The Rothschild family is one of the wealthiest families the world has ever known. By the early 1800s, they established themselves as the most important bankers in all Europe. By the end of the 19th century, they're said to control half the wealth of the world. As Rothschild biographer Derek Wilson explains, Rothschild critics have justification for their anxiety. The House of Rothschild is immensely more powerful than any financial empire that has ever preceded it, and it's able to control governments behind the scenes, secretly.
Economic power, political power go hand in hand, and it's like Mayer Rothschild of the Rothschild banking family in Germany said, "Give me control of a nation's monetary system, and I care not who writes their laws."
Nathan Rothschild in 1820 might have had more right to say that than any of his successors. And the statement is more or less absurd. The Federal Reserve does not control the money supply. The Federal Reserve influences the money supply.
To say that the Federal Reserve only influences the money supply is like saying a robber with a gun to your head is only influencing you to give him his money. And of course, if you give him your money, you may be spared your life, but here again, you don't have your money anymore.
There has been, in the last 30 or 40 years, a much greater international flavor to the activities of the Fed because the banking system has become global. and you could no longer regulate the U.S. money supply by simply via the domestic Federal Reserve banks.
The Federal Reserve controls the very heart of what's happening with money, because money answers everything. It's the one thing that everybody wants. And when you give a private institution a monopoly on the creation of this money, you vest total control in that institution.
If you have the money, you can get any law passed you want. So who do you care whether Bill Clinton is president or who is senator from New Jersey? It doesn't make any difference, because you write a check and you get another senator.
One of the stickiest questions in this debate is this: just who owns the Federal Reserve?
The City of London set the whole thing up. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is principally owned by 5 merchant banks in London, chartered by the Bank of England.
Perhaps England, which many have considered a political satellite of the United States in recent years, is really the one pulling the strings of international policy.
It's not a matter of who owns the Fed, it's who controls it. The government has given the banks a monopoly, and then you see the Justice Department doing nothing about the bank mergers. A monopoly can only exist with government assistance, and they've given great assistance to the banking monopoly.
Investigative journalist Bill Still says the Federal Reserve was sold to the Congress and the American people to bring stability to the economy. But in reality, it did the exact opposite.
It was sold as a way to bring stability to the American economy. Well, what happens just a little over a decade after the passage of the Fed? We see the biggest depression of this century in any case.
For the 16 months prior to the crash of '29, the Federal Reserve increased the money supply by 62%. Now, what was happening back then? Much like it's happening today. People were buying and selling, pledging and borrowing, thinking the good times would never end. And then at the time of the crash, they pulled the plug on the money supply, and the people who had pledged their stocks, their bonds, their homes, their cars, everything, they pledged their savings accounts, they lost it all.
Many believe that these international bankers even start wars, funding both sides of the conflict, and anticipation that all of us will react in predictable ways.
Every major war, every major conflict, arms sales, loaning money to governments. You get their people to pay you interest back into the coffers of the bank, money that you created out of nothing.
Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman claimed that the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression by deliberately reducing the amount of money in circulation.
Depositors all over the country were frightened about the safety of their funds and rushed to withdraw them. There were runs, there were failures of banks by the droves, and all the time, the Federal Reserve System stood idly by when it had the power and the duty and the responsibility to provide the cash that would have enabled the banks to meet the insistent demands of their depositors without closing their doors.
Congressman Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Banking Committee during the crash, agreed, saying, "The Great Depression was a carefully contrived occurrence by international bankers seeking to bring about a condition of despair so that they might emerge as the rulers of us all."
There was a memo circulated in advance of the stock market collapse. All the big guys, or the insiders, let's say, got out of the stock market during that 4-year period. They all got out. They were cash heavy when the market crashed. They were able to buy up major corporations for pennies on the dollar.
Franklin Roosevelt's own son-in-law called the Depression the deliberate shearing of the public by the world money power, triggered by the planned sudden shortage of call money in the New York markets. Insider Joseph Kennedy's wealth grew from $4 million in 1929 to over $100 million 4 years later. Then, as now, America's press failed to tell us what was happening. These scenes of unrest in America have never been seen before. Cameramen would shoot them, but newsreels wouldn't play them. Controlling the news started early in America. Of course, the lighter side of the news continued to get lots of blame.
Around the first bend, it's Rumble Wing by a beat. Club's Feather in second, and Hop skipping a jump. Now coming around the turn, it's Black's Feather. Hop skipping a jump, it's Red Dog. And Hop
Fortunately, populists from President Andrew Jackson to William Jennings Bryan to Father Charles Coughlin were courageous enough to speak the truth.
May I remind our President with all due respect that not one of these soldiers cast a ballot on that fateful Good Friday night in the spring of 1917 to force a peace-loving nation like ours to take up arms for the profiteers and the exploiters of mankind.
And during the Depression, no one was more dangerous to the banking interests than Huey Long.
We've tried the Republican Party, we've tried the Democratic Party, then we've gone back and tried the Republican Party, and now we're back trying the Democratic Party. And unfortunately, whenever we get into power with either one of these parties, we find that the one crying need of our people, the redistribution of wealth, so that none would be too poor and none would be too rich, is always neglected by the party that is in power.
How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat? The only way you'll ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub he ain't got no business with.
But assassination as a tool of political policy was nothing new to this crowd.
President Jackson, for example, in his era, he was the leading opponent of the privately owned central bank. Well, what happened to him was an assassin who was connected to international bankers, it was later found out, got right up to Jackson, stuck 2 pistols in his belly, fired both at the same time, both misfired. Jackson was saved. And interestingly enough, even though history books don't spend much time dwelling on this bank problem, Jackson himself numbered this as his leading accomplishment. In fact, on his tombstone, do you know what's on it? It's "I killed the bank."
7 changes the rules.
Going back to the American Civil War, Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck declared, "The division of the United States was decided by the high financial powers of Europe. They were afraid that the U.S. would upset their financial domination over the world. They saw tremendous booty if they could substitute 2 feeble democracies burdened with debt to the financiers in place of the vigorous republic sufficient unto herself." Abraham Lincoln realized this and so stood firmly for preservation of the Union. But Lincoln needed money to win, lots of it. He went to the Wall Street bankers who wanted 36% interest per annum. Honest Abe chose a less expensive alternative, choosing to have Congress issue the money. The bills were called greenbacks, and they weren't backed by gold, only by the full faith and credit of the United States. With Congress issuing the money, not 1 penny of interest was paid to private bankers.
The assassination of Lincoln was related to the bankers wanting control of the money. The same thing went for John Kennedy, that he was planning to reintroduce the U.S. notes rather than Federal Reserve notes. And of course we go back to the Constitution of the United States, which provides that the Congress shall coin the money, the currency, and regulate the value thereof.
If you go out and ask the average person on the street who issues the money, they'll say the government issues the money. That's why the lie works, because people know intuitively that the government should issue the money.
Well, the Federal Reserve is neither federal and has doubtful reserves. You will not find the Federal Reserve in the blue pages of government in any phone book. You will find it in the business pages next to Federal Express.
Congressman Louis McFadden fought the Fed to his last breath. He once called it a superstate controlled by international bankers and international industrialists acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure. 2 attempts were made on his life, one from a man wielding 2 pistols, both shots missed, and the second from a poisoning attempt, but fortunately there was a doctor on hand to pump his stomach.
Many historians believe that there are powerful institutions and organizations in place that actually even perpetuate this scheme. Dean Stockwell explains.
Of course, a conspiracy powerful enough to cause both world wars and the Great Depression would have to have a clubhouse somewhere, if only to split up the cash. It turns out they do.
If you haven't heard of the Bilderbergers, it's for one reason only. They haven't wanted you to. At their annual closed-door meetings, no outsiders are allowed even close to the building. Here are gathered the most powerful individuals of the Western world, united regularly at club meetings. Yet nothing is reported by the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the LA Times.
What really fascinates me is the complete blackout in the American press. For more than 20 years, I've gone down to the press club every day. I check the wires in their library, mingled with other paper boys, and I asked them the question many times, why, when if 120 film stars or 120 NFL football players met behind locked and guarded doors at a remote location for 3 days, you'd try very hard to penetrate and find out what those movie stars or football players are doing. Well, I had no curiosity at all when 120 of the world's most powerful financial leaders and political leaders meet for 3 days in a remote location behind armed guards in a complete blackout. Well, I had no curiosity.
Actually, quite a bit of security, but it's discreet.
So what would happen if someone tried to sneak through the trees back there?
I don't know. I wouldn't want to try it.
What we do hear coming out of those meetings is incredible about the plans of the New World Order to consolidate power. Political power and economic power coming together at the highest level. But what I call the lapdog media, the controlled media in this country, you would think that they would be going to court, crying freedom of information, open meetings, sunshine law, and all of these things, but the silence is deafening.
Attendees at recent Bilderberg meetings have included Presidential Advisor George Stephanopoulos, Senator Sam Nunn, David Rockefeller, former Senator Lloyd Bentsen, and Henry Kissinger. 1 month earlier, 50 liberal groups met in Washington to discuss their opposition to international banks and economic globalization. In reaction, one of the major items on the Bilderberger agenda was the role of liberals in various organizations. Also on the docket, the separatist movement in Canada, how fragmented Canadian provinces could be absorbed into the United States. Next, the expansion of NAFTA from Alaska to Chile, to boost corporate profits by encouraging American businesses to move to Latin American countries, where the costs of labor are low and environmental laws are not enforced. Do organizations like the Bilderbergers, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Federal Reserve pull the strings of our lives like master puppeteers? Or are such ideas merely the paranoid ravings of conspiracy theorists?
The people who call conspiracy theorists are not the conspiracy theorists themselves. We're talking about facts here. The Bilderberg Group does exist. The Federal Reserve does exist. The people who are members of the Bilderberg Group are also the people who do control the Federal Reserve. These are all facts.
David Rockefeller himself thanked the media for keeping this all hushed up. If it wouldn't have been for you, then we wouldn't have been able to pursue our interests towards internationalism. They're conspiring to eliminate the United States as we know it through something as simple as the elimination of our national identity.
Investigative journalist Bill Still says that these international bankers make up what he calls the Fifth Estate, using their elitist organizations to mold public opinion among policymakers.
Well, the Fifth Estate are the international bankers, and they just couldn't accomplish their goals without being to control the electronic media. Now, what they hate more than anything else is this outbreak amongst the internet, cable TV, radio talk shows. That's what they can't control. They need control, and without it, they aren't going to get what they want.
Of course, one person's sinister conspiracy could just be another person's private affair.
The Bilderberg is a clubby atmosphere. That's what it is, really. It's a clubby affair, by invitation only.
Now, when you see groups like Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderbergers, Trilateral Commission, you have to remember bankers work internationally, and the central banks in all countries work together, and they do this through special groups. They formed the Council on Foreign Relations at the Versailles Peace Conference after World War I. Now, many conservatives believe the CFR runs in the United States, but it only does it secondhand because the real orders come out of London first.
Decisions arrived at in secret Bilderberger meetings apparently do affect our lives as much, if not more, than the policies adopted through Democrat-Republican squabbling.
So is there a conspiracy? Let's examine it.
Is there a conspiracy? If we are onto the fomenters of what's loosely called the New World Order, the free movement of capital and goods across national boundaries is clearly a big part of their agenda.
The global elite have been the primary promoters of free trade precisely because of the fact that they are the ones who control the major multinational corporations. They are the ones who want to build televisions in Mexico and in impoverished third world countries and pay these people sub-minimum wages, slave wages, and then export them at gigantic profits back to the United States. But we're told by the major media in this country, which is tied in again with these international elites, that, oh, well, this is a temporary thing. It really is good for America. But it's not good for America. Look at anybody who's lost their job. Look at how their family suffers. That's the Bilderberg Group at work. That's the Trilateral Commission. That's the Federal Reserve. All these elite groups that they're benefiting, but the average American isn't.
These families have been mostly in the banking business for at least 500 years, most of them. They were in the slave trade, they were in the opium trade, because these people are not interested in 5% a year return. They want 1,000% a year return. And to get into those things, you need to get into gold, slaves, drugs. That's where the big money is.
Fiat currency is what we have. Fiat, meaning no thing, nothing, having no value. In other words, it's backed by the faith and credit of the person who is creating the money. If you have a private bank out here that is creating this money, then your faith is in their ability to keep the value of this currency to where everybody accepts it. We have to understand that people, not governments, not central banks, nor nation states, but people ultimately determine what money is and what money is not. It's been that way for over 5,000 years.
This brings us back to our initial question. Are we citizens of a great democracy, or is something more convoluted and sinister at work? Is there anything wrong with the best and the brightest controlling our country, or potentially in the near future the entire world? Are international financiers in control of our lives? Are they masters of the universe?
What's wrong with an elite ordering world events? There's a lot of things wrong with that. The American people, at least, have always been told that they control their own destiny through their elected representatives. But when you find their elected representatives behind closed doors, surrounded by armed guards who will not let the general public in, and they're making decisions that affect the future of the American people and the people of the world, then there are legitimate questions as to why this elite should be able to dictate things.
The whole point of one world government is to eliminate the concept of nationalism. Now, why is eliminating nationalism bad if it would eliminate war? Well, the reason is, if old British Lord Acton's axiom, that is, absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely.
If you could print $1 billion tomorrow, well, you could be a master of the universe. But you can't, because they have the monopoly. As long as they can print the money, as long as they can buy the New York Times, the Washington Post, congressmen, senators, presidents, then you can't compete against them. What have you got to offer?
If you have relatively few people governing your government, you don't have a democratic government, do you? You've got a secret cabal here who is governing the United States. And not just the United States, but the governments of England and France, Germany, all the European countries, less influence in Japan, but quite a bit there too. So it's a conspiracy against the people of the United States and of the Western world. What would you call it?
Are the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and the people in their sphere of influence the masters of the universe? Let's put it this way, they want to be the masters of the universe, but there are a lot of people who don't want them to be.
They create money out of nothing. What a scam. They have so much money, they don't care about money. All they care about is power. All they care about is being able to control the political situation so it goes their way. But they still have not been able to succeed in America because of the wealth and the independence and the patriotic spirit of the American middle class. That's the only thing that's holding this world from a situation of total despotism.
See, if I serve you a black cup of coffee and it's 95% coffee but 5% arsenic, it's mostly coffee, but it's going to kill you in the end. What we've been doing is we've been getting a truth-error mixture of events going on around the world. Enough truth to make it seem plausible, but enough error to get you off course. A lot of it has to do with our educational systems, where we've been dumbing our kids down. And when you dumb them down, it's the cruelest form of censorship, because most of this current generation can't even read the books that these guys would be scared of.
It's only fitting that we end with a quote from the man who started it all, Woodrow Wilson, a dreamer who tried to change the world for the better, but who in his final years ended up regretting many of the important accomplishments attributed to his presidency. "We are controlled by a small group of dominant men," he said, "of the worst ruled and most completely controlled governments in the civilized world." Is there a sinister conspiracy in control of our lives? Are there masters of the universe? If there are, I'm not one of them, nor would I want to be. Democratic societies have always been the crowning glory of human civilization, and in a democracy, the people decide. They don't have their decisions made for them. Masters of the universe, you've seen the evidence, you decide.
Well, friends, you've seen the documentary excerpts from Monopoly Men, and truly they are monopoly men because they have a monopoly on the creation of paper money. We gave them that monopoly, as you saw back in 1913 with the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. Now, there will be others that will argue that we're in a struggle between communism and capitalism. And you'll have a lot of the socialists and communists that will say, well, capitalism is bad. Well, let me give you a startling truth. There is nothing but a capitalistic system in a modern world. What is capital? Capital is the means of production. Capital are the tractors in the field, the trucks on the highways, the trains, the manufacturing plants, and you'll have to agree that there is capital even today in communist China. There is capital even in communist Cuba. There is capital even in communist Venezuela. So where's the struggle? The struggle is between monopolistic capitalism and competitive capitalism. And that, my friends, the choice of that is determined by your political system. Limited government brings competitive capitalism. Big government restricts capital, and it becomes a monopolistic capitalistic system. So capital is always looking for a home. And as we see from the chart, we will see that capital is looking for a home for two areas. Number one, it looks for political stability. What is the political climate? If you have a big governmental system, if you have a socialistic system or a communistic system, capital usually flees such a system. And it then looks for economic stability. What are the economic policies of the country? What are the central bank policies of the country? And of course it gets back to the Federal Reserve. What are their policies? What are they doing? Are they printing more money, or are they keeping the money stable where it has strong purchasing power? Ever since 1971, every economic crisis in the world has been a currency crisis, without exception. Now, what happened in 1971, let me back up just a little bit and say back to 1944. What happened in 1944 is really important because it was the International Monetary Conference at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where we adopted not only the World Bank, but the International Monetary Fund, but an agreement among the nations that all of the currencies of the world would float against one another, and they were redeemable in dollars at the Reserve Bank, the Federal Reserve in the United States, in gold. That's right, you could bring your dollars and bring it to the central bank or the Treasury Department of the United States and receive gold at the last official price. The last official price of gold, and remains so today, $42.22 an ounce. In other words, you could bring $42.22, get an ounce of gold, take it back to your central bank of your respective country. And that worked fine until the late 60s and early 70s. And we got involved in a very expensive military conflict in Southeast Asia called the Vietnam War. So when government spends money, it can only get it one of three ways: either tax the money, borrow the money, or print the money. So it was not popular to raise taxes. There was not enough savings to borrow all of the expenditures for the war. So the Federal Reserve printed the money. And all of these newly printed dollars were showing up all over the world. And people were saying, hey, there are too many dollars in the world. And they were bringing these dollars back to the Federal Reserve and redeeming them for gold. Now, why were they doing that? Well, the market price of gold on the international markets, it climbed to $65 to $67 an ounce. It's real simple. You simply bring $42.22 in to the Federal Reserve, get an ounce of gold, then sell it on the open market for $65 to $67 an ounce. We were losing all our gold. Richard Nixon was President of the United States at the time. And Richard Nixon had a choice. He could either lose all of our gold, or he could make some changes. Now, the honest thing to do would be to raise the official price of gold to the market price. However, can you imagine waking up in the morning and reading the front page of your local newspaper, President devalues dollar by 50%? You'd see prices double overnight. So what the President did was he closed the gold window. He repudiated the Bretton Woods Agreement, and he unofficially devalued the dollar. You could no longer redeem dollars for gold, and as a result, since 1971, all of the currencies of the world have been sinking against one another. That's right, not floating, but sinking against one another. All currencies are sinking. Some just happen to be sinking faster than others. Now, let's take a look and see the evolution of the US dollar. We see that the 1950 dollar shows that this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable in lawful currency at the United States Treasury or at any Federal Reserve Bank. Now, what is lawful currency? Well, we go back to Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, that no state shall make anything tender in the payment of a debt but gold or silver coin. So this was a legal tender, lawful Federal Reserve note. What's a note? It's a promise to pay. And then when you see the other Federal Reserve note, you see that something has been left off. In other words, it says this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable in nothing. In other words, we have now become an IOU. I was reading the Denver Post, October the 24th, 2003, Denver Post. And when I looked at this paper, I saw that the headlines of the business section, that co-creator of the euro offers Terra. Now, you're seeing on the screen right now, the Terra project is the launch of a commodity-backed trade reference currency. It's a supranational currency that allegedly works in parallel with national money systems. It is supposedly uniquely designed to provide stable international mechanism for planning, contractual, and payment purposes worldwide, but some say it's only an attempt to keep the international bankers in control of the world monetary system. Let's take a closer look at that article. And we see in the article that Bernard Littauer, a co-architect of the euro, will unveil a new global currency called the Terra next week in Denver as an antidote to a worsening economic slump. For Littauer, alternatives need to be found to the current faith-based monetary system, or else the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world risk following Japan down the path of economic stagnation. He goes on to say that dropping interest rates and increasing the money supply has proven it does not work. He said, commenting on the current U.S. strategy to revive its economy. You see, the Japanese have increased their money supply 30% a year and have dropped interest rates to 0% over 12 years without reviving their economy. Now, what does $12 trillion mean to you? Well, while the analysis may be somewhat unfamiliar to many people, the meaning is very straightforward. $18 trillion is about half of the total household wealth in the United States. You see, the total household wealth in the United States was $40.2 trillion in 2002, and the combined Social Security and Medicare shortfall is nearly $18 trillion. What does this mean? It means the federal government would have to confiscate almost half of all household wealth to have the necessary money to close both these programs' future financing gaps. Now, of course, it's not going to be necessary to pre-fund promised Social Security benefits and Medicare benefits immediately. In theory, the Congress could enact a 7.1% permanent increase in the payroll tax to close the combined shortfalls over time, and this would mean a permanent payroll tax increase to a rate of 22.4% and amount to about $3,000 in additional taxes every year for the average family. Now, friends, a tax increase of this magnitude is unthinkable. It would devastate the economy, job growth, family finances, but it does indicate the magnitude of the problem that we would be facing. And to top it all off, we have had a Senate of the United States that has even voted an immigration bill to allow illegal immigrants to load on to the Social Security system. Insanity, folks. That is absolute insanity. So let's look and see exactly what is the economic and political risk that we're facing. We have a chart on the screen that divides your assets into ownership and loanership. One thing that we know for certain is that either we're going to have collapse if the Federal Reserve does not print and increase more money and credit into circulation in the economy. So given that, we're going to have a collapse one of these days anyway when we have an inflationary collapse if they continue to print the money. Because every year that the debt bubble grows to higher levels, it requires more money and credit to service just the debt. You see, that $25 trillion of domestic debt is like a herd of cows. It's eating and drinking every day. It has to be serviced. So how do you service debt? You have to pay money. The first dollar to service debt goes for the interest payments, and then it goes to pay the principal. So you always are in a posture of having more money and credit into the economy. And since the Federal Reserve and the banking system has a monopoly on the creation of paper money, you're always having to be in a posture of getting on the banker's treadmill and work for the banker to pay the interest on the debt. It's a never-ending cycle that requires you to be in bondage to the banking system. So let's take a look. Two categories of assets, ownership and loanership. In a period of a depreciating currency, if you leave your assets in a loanership capacity, such as Federal Reserve notes, money market funds, CDs, T-bills, annuities, bonds, and notes, all of these are paper assets that mean that you're going to be paid back with depreciated dollars. In other words, the dollars that you get paid back with will have less value than the dollars you originally put in. So what do? Well, if you'll notice from the chart, I have listed all of these assets in the order of declining liquidity. In other words, your Federal Reserve notes are more liquid than your notes or your bonds. And so start moving from less liquid assets up to more liquid assets on the loanership side, and then start moving over from loanership over into your ownership type assets, such as gold, silver, the precious metals, stocks and real estate and collectibles. Now let's cover the ownership assets. Collectibles are the least liquid of all of your ownership assets, such as art, oriental rugs, Chinese vases, things like that. baseball cards, old car collections. Their ownership, but in a tight economic time, they're not very liquid. Let's look at real estate. Real estate is perhaps the most tenuous thing that we have going right now, because as interest rates rise, real estate values will come down. There are some markets in the country today, like California, like the East Coast, Florida, that are already experiencing declines from the real estate bubble that built up over the past several years due to low interest rates. As interest rates rise, real estate values will come down. Now, one thing that I want to remind you, one of the things that I believe is going to be one of the best investments in real estate is agricultural land, paid for agricultural real estate. Why? Because we have a problem of production. We have a problem of not enough food. We import quite a bit of food coming into the United States. Besides that, I believe that things are going to get so bad in the cities that people will want to leave the cities and come and live in the country. What about stocks? Stocks are an ownership asset, but the only thing that gives stock value is earnings. You see, a real value of a stock is where you take all of the assets of a corporation, liquidate it, divide that by the number of shares. That's the true value of that corporation. Anything above that liquidated value is dependent upon one thing, and that's earnings. If stocks don't have earnings, then you don't have any real value. I would be out of all stocks except for energy-related stocks, defense-related stocks, and the mining stocks. That is where I think the real value is in the stock. In the precious metals, we recommend everyone have at least 30% of their total assets, up to a maximum of 50 to 55% of their assets in precious metals. Why gold and silver? Simply, gold and silver are the only monetary assets that aren't somebody else's liability. In other words, gold and silver is money. Anything else is credit. Silver not only is a monetary metal, it's an industrial metal. It has a dual purpose in having silver and also having gold. So in summary, what do? We take stock of our assets. Be careful to know the state of your flocks and categorize your assets into these two categories. Start moving from loanership into ownership, get real liquid. Remember this old saying that cash at the crash will be king. That's cash in your CDs, your money market accounts, your checking accounts, your savings accounts, and cash in the precious metals. You see, folks, we have a choice. You've seen the monopoly men, you've seen how they control things. You see, if you don't totally use their money, they can't totally rip you off. So we have a choice. We can either sit there and let them dish it out to us, or we can do something about it. Take action. Action on the information that you've received.